You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. We're going to get back into an Answers in Genesis conference talk by one Joel Lineweber, which I've recently learned is how to say it, who's going to talk to us about the 7 dramatic differences between birds and dinosaurs, without ever having actually defined either. As a reminder, this exact logic can be used to argue that whales aren't mammals. And as a further reminder, here are the 7 dramatic differences between whales and mammals that show that whales can't be mammals. 1. Whales have only 2 limbs, mammals have 4. 2. Whales have a tail fluke, mammals don't. 3. Whale pelvises don't connect to the spine, but mammal pelvises do. Whales have flippers, not feet or hands like mammals. 5. Whales have blubber, mammals don't. 6. Whales are born tail first, mammals are born head first. 7. Whales are water animals, but mammals live on land, at least sometimes. So if you don't think those are good reasons to kick whales out of the Mammals Club, just remember that when it comes to kicking out birds from the Dinosaur Club. Anyway, here's Joel.
So let's jump into the 7 dramatic differences between dinosaurs and birds.
I am all ready.
There's a lot of diagrams I'm going to show you in this talk, and they're also in this paper. So if you want to do a deep dive on this topic and the anatomy side of things, check out Answers Research Journal, my paper there.
So that paper is written by Joel himself and features his art prominently. I have to say, I think he is a talented artist, and is certainly better at digital painting than I am. The paper is all about reconstructing Microraptor as a bird, a term that the paper does not define, and it also does not even argue that Microraptor is a bird. Instead, it simply directs the reader to a source that the body of the text labels Fiducia 2020, which sounds like a peer-reviewed paper from 2020 from Alan Fiducia arguing that Microraptor is a bird. But no, it's not. It's his non-peer-reviewed lay-level book, Romancing the Birds and Dinosaurs, Forays in Postmodern Paleontology, meaning that it's not an academic source even though it is written by a PhD who has published papers before. That's the book that rather famously and hilariously took at face value a blog post by paleontologist Dr. Darren Neisch that he published on April 1st, 2017, that satirically argued that many dinosaur lineages had survived the KPG extinction event. It was a literal joke published on April Fool's Day, and it went into the source that Joel is using as the basis for not just this talk, but also the quote-unquote paper that this is based on. The book also simply dismisses data from multiple studies on the grounds that the conclusions are biased, which is a bit rich coming from the guy who is dismissing data because it doesn't fit his bias. Further, the book has had essentially no impact, having a whopping total of 7 citations on Google Scholar, 1 being Fiducia citing himself, and 2 of them being Darren Neisch's blog post, although one of those 2 is a German translation. That means fully half of the citations are either blog posts critical of Fiducia, or just Fiducia pointing out his own past work. Another one is a review in a Columbian ornithology journal that doesn't seem to be available online anymore. So this talk arguing that birds are not dinosaurs is based on a paper based on a book of more or less no scientific merit. And that paper doesn't even argue that birds are not dinosaurs, nor does it define either group. So this is just an outstanding showing from Answers in Genesis. Also, his paper concludes that Archaeopteryx had a beak, something that not even Alan Fiducia seems to agree on. In fact, in the section in which he argues for a beak, he provides no reason for reconstructing Microraptor with a beak, except that no one can prove it didn't have one, and that it sure would be nice for him if it did. Rather amusingly, he also cites several works that show how beaks can be inferred from the skull anatomy without preserved beak material, then goes on to point out Microraptor lacks any such signs of having had a beak, and then just moves on as if that weren't a problem because according to him, that work was based on cladistic assumptions, whatever that means.
I also want to give a big shout out to Dr. Haynes for all of the groundwork that she has laid on the research side of things. She's just done an amazing job.
Such an amazing job that even other creationists have put her on blast for one of the shoddiest blog posts creationism has ever seen. I reviewed it, and I reviewed the review of it by other creationists. I'll just say this. Not only is that paper atrociously bad, it revealed that Dr. Haynes doesn't even read the works she cited or can't understand them, doesn't understand how to read a cladogram, and like Joel, is uninterested in actually defining dinosaur. And is okay with calling Archaeopteryx a bird despite it not actually meaning the definition of bird she herself cited and advocated for in the paper. If I had published something that bad in high school, I think I'd just go crawl into a cave and live there for the rest of my life out of embarrassment. Maybe I could live in St. Anthony the Great's cave in Egypt.
So you guys ready? We've got to move fast. All right.
I've been as ready as I can be the whole time.
So, our scientists
Scientists don't start with required conclusions. AIG has a statement of faith requiring their employees to start with required conclusions. Therefore, there are and cannot be any answers in Genesis scientists. It is currently a logical impossibility.
Our scientists have done some just incredible work, really studying, going deep into the papers and the fossils and studying all these specimens to try to figure out what's special about birds.
Have they? In what publications? Certainly not Haynes or Lineweber's paper, in which they don't even bother attempting to discuss that and either don't bother saying what a bird even is, or use a definition that contradicts their own use of the term. It's hard for me to imagine an organization that has done or could do a worse job at figuring out what makes birds special. I mean, I could tell you a bunch of reasons off the top of my head, and have already listed a bunch of them in the previous video, and I'm just some dinosaur at a desk, or right now a bee, not someone with millions of dollars of funding. It's almost like Answers in Genesis doesn't actually care about figuring out birds, but they just like being able to say that they are doing it to their donors who are not going to read whole articles in their Answers Research blog.
And guess what? Birds have wings.
Okay.
It's a very deep concept, I know. Birds have wings. And that ties back to that concept we saw in Genesis, right? Wings are important. So, the first 4 criteria we're going to talk about, the first 4 dramatic differences, are related to the wings. And the first one we've already talked about a little bit, wing feathers, right? So, these aren't just random feathers attached to the body. Birds have wing feathers. Feathers, not filaments.
This is starting to sound a whole lot like someone saying whales have baleen, therefore they can't be mammals. And also note that we're still using his stipulative definition of feathers that he has already dishonestly tried to use to exclude proto-feathers from consideration on the mere grounds of his word games. But also, we have evidence of proto-feathers being attached to wing-like patterns from other animals that are not even in Maniraptora, such as Concavenator, which has ulnar knobs that are consistent with quill knobs, and even Ornithomimids, which have feathers that are indeed branching and have a rachis. So, I guess they're feathers. Further, Tyrannosaurs like Eutyrannus are preserved with branching protofeathers that lack a rachis, making them similar to modern down feathers. So, as long as we're not playing word games to trick the audience, we have proto-wings with proto-feathers. And further, what is a wing? Well, it's a funny arm that's used for flying, that's it. It's not some brand new structure with no precursors in the fossil record.
If we look at that Archaeopteryx fossil, you can see the feathers are arranged very beautifully into a wing, just like modern birds today. Same thing with the Dromaeosaur, Microraptor, a wing. Very clearly, wing feathers there.
Yeah, it looks like this arrangement of prominent integumentary structures goes way back farther into Theropoda than even Coelurosauria. Never mind Maniraptora. And we should expect derived theropods closer to modern birds to have a fairly modern-seeming feather arrangement, especially given how far back the basic arrangement goes. This is evidence for birds being dinosaurs, not against it. If birds aren't dinosaurs, then why do we see bird-like structures in animals like Allosaurids and Tyrannosauroids?
This one's a little bit harder to see. This is Caudipteryx. It's an oviraptorosaur. And there's kind of the body outline. They had smaller wings. They were probably flightless, but still, feathers are still arranged in a wing shape.
Of course, there's a problem. How do we know if that's because Caudipteryx is transitional between more basal coelurosaurs and birds, or because it's just a bird that has lost the power of flight? Focusing on just the remiges won't help, because modern flightless birds also typically have symmetrical remiges, like Caudipteryx, as noted on his slide. Well, we check for the derived characteristics shared by birds, such as the Carpometacarpus, Tarsometatarsus, keeled sternum, etc. And we find that Caudipteryx doesn't have most of them, meaning that it fits perfectly into the definition for a transition between basal theropods and derived members of aves, which remember is what Haynes argues should be used as our definition for bird. And Joel here has cited her work, meaning that presumably he agrees with her on that, meaning that Caudipteryx is not only not a bird, but it's a perfect transitional species demonstrating the evolution of birds from theropods.
So here's a diagram of those, some of those animals. This is a dove, and you can see the 3 different groups of feathers there. The primary feathers, which are the feathers attached to kind of those finger bones. The secondary feathers are attached to the arm, the ulna bone. And the alula feathers are attached to that first digit, the gray feathers right there.
Of course, the problem here is that our earliest evidence of alula feathers are from Eoalulavis, which erects the taxon of Alulavis, which combines the enantiornithine dinosaurs along with the avian dinosaurs via the derived trait of having an alula. In fact, Joel's reason stated for giving animals like Microraptor and Caudipteryx alula feathers is that he thinks they had them because reasons and God, and he doesn't like mean evolutionists. He presents literally no evidence that these animals had alula feathers, and I would like to point out that Archaeopteryx, Microraptor, and Caudipteryx are all known from multiple specimens, many of which feature near-perfect feather impressions, and none of them have alula feathers. That presents very strong evidence that they did not have them, because we have fossils with far better preservation than would be needed for them to be observed, and yet we don't observe them. His argument is basically that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and while that's a fun mantra, it's not actually always true. For example, you can't simply say that because I have no evidence of an elephant in my house that I should remain undecided on whether or not to accept the proposition that there is an elephant in my house. The presence of many things, like elephants and alula feathers, leave behind expected evidence, such as, a visible elephant, dung, a distinct odor, elephant noises in the case of the elephant, and preserved feather imprints in fossils that preserve such in the case of feathers. If the presence of an elephant should produce certain observable facts that are absent, it is reasonable to conclude that there is no elephant, and it would require extraordinary positive evidence to overcome that conclusion. Similarly, if there is no evidence of alula feathers, even in fossils where the animal's thumb and other remages are clearly and exceptionally preserved, then it requires positive evidence of an alula to conclude that they existed. We have no such evidence.
If we look at the feathers on Microraptor, the dromaeosaur, again, same type of arrangement, right? Very similar to modern birds, arranged in a fan shape, got all these different things that make it just like a bird.
Yeah, including a completely made-up alula.
Same thing with Caudipteryx.
Right down to the made-up thumb feathers.
The feathers are shaped a little bit different. The wing is a little bit different shape because different birds have different shaped wings based on how they fly. But
Caudipteryx doesn't actually meet the definition of a bird in the sense of member of aves. So ignoring the things he's making up, what does calling Caudipteryx a bird mean for the evidence for birds being dinosaurs? Literally nothing. Nothing about any definition for dinosaur that has ever been proposed includes not having primary and secondary feathers attached to digit 2 of the manus and the ulna. In fact, adding that would be special pleading. So is Caudipteryx a dinosaur? Well, yeah, it has all the features of a dinosaur, as well as some of the features of a bird. Sounds like a transitional fossil to me.
Still, bird. They're not feathers that are randomly attached to the body or something like that, evolving, partially functional. These are fully formed wings.
Well, first, no one really expects to see individual feathers just sticking out of random places. Feathers follow feather lines, which themselves are just areas of skin that have distinct developmental signals related to integument. You see the same basic thing across reptilia. Snakes have specific belly scales and face scales. Crocodilians have very distinct regions for their scutes, and the scutes in these regions have very different shapes. Some such regions include the flanks, the belly, and several such lines going down the back all the way to the tail. This means that we should expect that if birds are reptiles and their feathers are homologous to the scales and scutes of other reptiles, that they should always have been occurring along such lines. And yeah, that's what we see. Joel here is just strawmanning evolution. Further, note that he says they're not half-formed feathers, instead they're fully branching feathers. Well, that means that, at least in this case, we can understand what he means by half or not fully formed feathers. He means feathers that don't branch. But the problem is that he already just, by fiat, declared that such structures aren't feathers. So when he sees what actually are half-formed feathers, he just declares that they're not feathers and then moves on. It's basically just a thought-stopping technique. It's literally cult behavior.
And another thing that birds have around their wings is something called patagia. And this soft tissue, the red and the blue you can see there, the red is the propatagia and the blue is the postpatagia. And it's a complex system of tendons, ligaments, and nerves that automatically fold the wing feathers when the wing closes.
There's skin involved too, but sure.
And it connects to the skeleton. It's really a remarkable system, so that the bird, basically when the bird stretches out its elbow, the wing automatically opens up. And when it closes its elbow, the wing automatically folds.
He's right, and you can even see this next time you cook a bird. Take the wing and hold it by the upper part over the humerus and then below the elbow. Then flex the elbow joint, and you'll see the hand also flexes.
It's just an amazing structure that God created. So, if these feathered manoraptors are birds,
which they're not, even according to the paper from Haynes he cited,
we would expect to find evidence of something like this in the fossil record, right?
Well, yes, but we would also expect to find it in non-bird dinosaurs if birds evolved from dinosaurs. And so we do. Pointing to dinosaurs that have some but not all of the features of modern birds is pointing to transitional fossils that should not exist if special creation were true, but that are predicted by the theory of evolution. Just calling these animals birds doesn't actually change that. It's just a word game.
Well, guess what we find? On several of these feathered maniraptors, we find evidence of this soft tissue. You can see it there. This is Anchiornis. And not only do we find kind of that body outline of that, we also find little feather follicles in the skin if you use the right kind of light on this fossil. And that's significant because
it's a feature unique among extant animals to birds, which also share a whole suite of characteristics in common that Anchiornis lacks, meaning that no matter whether you call it a bird or not, it's transitional.
This is something that evolutionists don't talk about when they talk about feather evolution.
Yeah, that's going to be a citation needed.
You can see in that diagram, that little picture on the right there, every feather in the skin of a bird each has nerves, blood vessels, and muscles that attach to it.
Yeah, that's pretty standard for the outside structures of animals. Turtles can feel touch, including pain on the horny exterior of the carapace, and some even seem to enjoy gentle petting or scratching from humans. Mammal hair also has a blood supply and nerves. Even the scales and scutes of other reptiles have sensory nerves and blood supply to the living portions under the outermost layers. Feathers are only different in degree.
So there's a whole network system of the nervous system and the blood vessels and the muscles to control these feathers individually in some cases, and to be able to grow these feathers, to be able to release them, to be able to grow another one in its place. And it's a sensory system, so that when a bird is flying, kind of like if somebody touches the hairs on your arm or something like that, you can feel it, right? Birds have that with their feathers.
Is Joel just unfamiliar with the concept of integument? This is all stuff that integument has always been doing, even in the common ancestor of, all chordates, probably. None of this is surprising, and far from being some problem for the evolution of birds from dinosaurs, it was something dinosaurs themselves inherited back from hundreds of millions of years ago. All that's happening with feathers is that the muscles and nerves and blood that have always been part of the integumentary system, or skin if you will, are concentrating around particular structures. Further, we don't have evidence that the most primitive feathers, those on animals like Eutyrannus or Sinosauropteryx, had such complex innervation musculature or blood supply. So this also lines up with evolution. Features don't evolve in simple isolation. It's not like dinosaurs needed to evolve the exterior shape of asymmetrical flight remiges, and only after that's done can they work on evolving muscles to control their orientation. And only once both of those are done can they bother with a blood supply. And then finally on nerve endings or something. As the complexity of feathers increase, so do their metabolic needs. So blood supply to them will be advantageous because it keeps the feather for longer. Similarly, they started out with some sensory apparatus, and so innervation will increase to the degree it's a selective advantage to do so, which will increase as the structures become more and more important for a population's survival. Similarly, the degree to which the orientation of the integument is important is the degree to which it will evolve finer muscle control. As a non-bird example, look at North American porcupines. They can control the orientation of their quills based on the situation, and when they are calm and happy, their quills lie flat and you could almost forget they have them. But when they are angry, scared, or grumpy, they can raise their quills and become a pincushion of fury. Similarly, if your feathers are just downy feathers, there for basic insulation, you don't need much in the way of control over their orientation, and simple erector muscles like mammals have are probably plenty. But as soon as the feathers play any role at all in aerodynamics, then any increased control over their orientation can be selected for, since that will help with the aerodynamics.
So they can feel where the wind is so that they can adjust mid-flight. It's really remarkable.
Sure, it's remarkable. I just fail to see why that's a problem for evolution. In fact, it raises a question about this kind of objection from creationists. The basic form of the objection is to point to something about a living organism, proclaim how cool it is, and then to simply declare without much further reasoning that this is a problem for evolution. But this implies that there are some aspects of living organisms that aren't a problem. Otherwise, why single out some aspects of a particular organism? So, what do creationists think isn't a problem for evolution?
So, difference number one between dinosaurs and birds. Birds have feathers on their wings.
Right, but that's only true if you change what people mean by bird. Look, here's the restrictive version of bird that Haynes argued for in her paper, even though she got wrong what the definition actually was. It's the one I'm using in this series. It's class aves. Here's the term as it often gets used in the discussion, and it's basically aviale. But Joel is arguing for an even broader definition, Maniraptora. But as you can see on the cladograms, none of these definitions actually stops birds from being coelurosaurs, tetanurans, neotheropods, theropods, saurischians, dinosaurs, ornithodyrans, archosaurs, or reptiles. All he's done is redefine what a bird is to include winged dinosaurs that otherwise wouldn't be considered birds. That's wordplay, not evidence. No matter what you call Microraptor, it remains transitional between the dinosaur ancestors of birds and modern members of class Aves.
All right, difference number 2. Swivel wrist. All right, hold up your arm for me. All right, keep your arm straight and try to bend your wrist to the side.
I can't. As a ceratosaur, my wrists are actually exceptionally inflexible in any orientation. On the other hand, though, I have fingers that can flex backwards to an almost silly degree. You win some, you lose some.
How about you? I can't get past 45 degrees, or thereabouts.
I'm not sure I can even get to 1 degree.
That's because I have a human wrist, not a bird wrist. A bird wrist can fold all the way up beside its body. It can almost touch the finger bones to the side of the arm.
That's true.
That's because it has a swivel wrist. It's got a special bone in its wrist called a semilunate carpal. It's a half-moon-shaped bone, and that allows that wrist to swivel sideways. A bird can't really do this. Their wrist doesn't bend that way. It bends the other way. It swivels.
It also can't rotate. Most media depictions of dinosaurs have broken wrists. It's especially prominent in Jurassic Park, where the poor raptors are nude and broken-wristed. Jurassic Park really is a horror movie, even from the perspective of the poor dinosaurs.
So, if these feathered manoraptors are birds,
something that not even AIG was pushing just a few years ago,
our prediction is we would expect to see what? A swivel wrist in these animals, right?
Except that wasn't a prediction creationists made. There were no creationists out there predicting that manoraptors should have semilunate carpals. Indeed, in 2015, when the late David Menton gave a talk about this subject, he didn't even mention the idea, even though in April of 2020, suddenly he was claiming that all manoraptors were birds. So the prediction should have been made sometime between 2015 and 2020, which would be all well and good, except that you might remember this.
And look at the half-moon-shaped bones on the wrist. It's no wonder these guys learn how to fly.
How did this idea get into the public consciousness enough that it made it into the 1993 film Jurassic Park? It's because far from being a prediction of creationists, the presence of the semilunate carpal in manoraptors, or at least a subset of them, was well established some 40 or so years ago as of the time of this writing. For example, the 1982 paper, The Reptilian Relationships of Archaeopteryx by Ra Fulborn and T.L. Hanley, published in the Australian Journal of Zoology, indicates evidence for a semilunate carpal in several non-avian, in the traditional sense, dinosaurs, including Deinonychus, Velociraptor, and Stenonocosaurus. So this isn't something that creationists predicted, this is something they're trying to accommodate while still pretending that birds aren't dinosaurs.
Well, what do we find? That's exactly what we find. So you see, there's the chicken with the swivel wrist, Sapiornis, which is an extinct bird, and Microraptor. They all have the same bone and this swivel wrist functionality. So they have the ability to kind of close their wing.
Oh look, creationists have discovered something some 42 years after everyone else discovered that same thing. Talk about cutting-edge research. Also, at least as of 2021, Answers in Genesis was giving mixed messages on this, as can be seen in this video, uploaded to YouTube March 31st, 2021. You can clearly see a raptor animatronic labeled as such that is definitely not portraying the animal as a bird. Since I wanted to see if it was still there, on October 29th, 2024, I called the guest services line at the Creation Museum and inquired about the animatronic. It is indeed still there. Maybe someone should let them know that they're contradicting themselves. Or not. I actually find it funnier this way.
Now, if you look at the dinosaur wrist there on Allosaurus, it's very different. It doesn't bend that way. And that's consistent across all the theropod dinosaurs that we see here that are not birds. And so...
Except that it's not, though, is it? The kind of flexion that Joel is portraying as characteristic of birds is called abduction. And you can measure about how much abduction is possible in an animal's wrists with degrees. Modern birds can come close to 180 degrees of abduction. But the degree of abduction actually increases in dinosaurs well before we get to Maniraptora, as you get closer and closer to birds. Basal theropods probably had almost 0 degrees of abduction, but by the time that we get to Coelurosauria, the group that includes Tyrannosaurus and Compsognathids, as well as others, that is to say 4 of his 6 examples of dinosaurs, we find that the minimum abduction ability was probably around 15 degrees. By the time we get to Maniraptora, it has increased, but not even doubled. It's up to only 25 degrees for animals like Therizinosaurs and Oviraptorosaurs. Even in Microraptor, a flying non-avian dinosaur that AIG has long thought of as a bird, we only get to about 60 degrees of abduction. So, through the whole theropod line leaning to birds, we see slowly increasing abduction of the wrist, just like you might predict if birds are dinosaurs. It turns out that Joel just declaring anybody with about 25 degrees of abduction or more a bird doesn't really do anything to change the transitional sequence we see in wrist morphology.
You can see that bottom row, those are all different dinosaur wrists, and they function a little bit more like a human wrist. They have the ability to grasp.
So do most of the so-called bird hands there, including the juvenile Watzine. The only ones that don't are Anser, a goose, and Struthio, the ostrich.
But all of these feathered Maniraptorans have a swivel wrist. And this is a big problem for evolution.
Ah yes, discoveries that are in line with the hypothesis that birds are dinosaurs, which was proposed on the basis of evolutionary biology, are bad for evolution. Just like the increasing global temperatures are bad for climate science, which has been warning about such increases for decades. This checks out, and isn't at all a completely insanely brain-dead take.
Because somewhere along the way, this is a quote from an evolutionist, somewhere along the way from early dinosaurs to birds, wrists changed so much that we could be excused for thinking birds don't even have them.
Weird way of putting it, but okay.
Wrists went from straight to bent and hyperflexible, allowing birds to fold their wings neatly against their bodies when not flying. Underlying this change is a drop in the number of wrist bones from 9 to just 4.
So, how surprised would you be to learn that this quotation is literally the first two sentences of the abstract of the paper? Well, you shouldn't be surprised at all, because it is. The paper itself, which is linked in the description, is in fact about establishing homology in dinosaur carpal bones and supports the homology of the semilunate carpal as being a combination of two distal theropod carpals that fuse embryonically before ossification, which is supported by staining and embryological studies. The abstract of a paper sets up the question the paper is going to try to answer, or the problem is going to try to solve. Anytime you see someone quoting the first bits of an abstract and then simply accepting those statements as if they're the conclusion of the paper, that person is lying to you. Either they didn't read the paper and are pretending to by citing it, or they did read it and they're lying to you about what it says, because a citation implies that you read the cited work. So, let me know in the comments if Joel is lying about the paper or about having read the paper. If you think he's not lying, then please let me know what kind of stupidity he has that would result in him blatantly misrepresenting this paper.
He doesn't offer a lot of explanation of how this happened.
Really? This is from the paper. Quote, this time the researchers found that immunofluorescent staining for collagen supported paleontologists, strengthening the link between dinosaurs and birds. Like the first bird wrist bone, the second had two distinct regions of expression of both types of collagen. Accordingly, the researchers suggest that embryologists join paleontologists in calling the second bird wrist bone the semilunate. Next up is a bone of even greater contention. Some paleontologists call the third bird wrist bone, which is on top and away from the body, distal carpal 3. But embryologists believe that the third bone is entirely new. They call it element X, and view it as taking the place of a bone called the ulnare that is lost in bird development. It is true that the ulnare is fleeting in embryonic birds and is gone completely in adults, but the researchers found that the ulnare and element X coexist briefly in embryos of 7 bird species, and that the embryonic position of the latter corresponds with that of distal carpal 3. These findings refute the notion that element X is a new bone that replaces the ulnare. Rather, the researchers suggest that embryologists join paleontologists once again and use the term distal carpal 3 for the third bird wrist bone. However, paleontologists didn't win this round completely. They believe bird-like dinosaurs still had the bone that disappears in birds. But the researchers' re-examination of the fossil evidence showed that the ulnare had actually already been lost in the most bird-like dinosaurs, further strengthening the dinosaur-bird link. Last, the researchers sorted out the fourth and trickiest of the bird wrist bones, which is on the bottom and away from the body. This is the bone that gives the bird its bent shape and extreme outward flexibility. Paleontologists call the fourth bone the ulnare. On the other hand, developmental studies suggest that this bone is the pisiform, which is the wrist version of the kneecap. The fourth bird wrist bone is key to flight, transmitting force on the downstroke while restricting flexibility on the upstroke. This time, embryologists won. The pisiform is connected by a tendon to a particular muscle in the arm from lizards to mammals, and immunofluorescence for the tendon protein tenascin revealed that the same is true in bird embryos. Paleontologists can be somewhat forgiven for their mistake, however, because the pisiform is not evident in fossils of most bird-like dinosaurs. The researchers square the paleontological and developmental evidence by proposing that the pisiform was either tiny or failed to ossify in bird-like dinosaurs, but was then reacquired in birds. Such evolutionary reversals are rare, but not unprecedented. Besides illuminating how birds got the wrists that helped them fly, this work shows the benefits of combining paleontology and embryology to piece together evolution." End quote. Wow, sounds like explaining this is exactly what the paper did, and unlike Joel, who quoted the abstract, I bothered to actually quote the body of the paper. Also, the author, Robin Meadows, is a woman, and Joel just misgendered her.
This is a big problem for evolution. Like, what benefit would that give to an animal to completely re-engineer its wrist so it can bend sideways before it can even fly? Doesn't make sense.
There are a number of possibilities, like injury avoidance while running, which Maniraptors seem to do a fair bit. There's also the possibility that it allowed for low-energy prey capture motions in the forearm, something we know Maniraptors did. Since it also stiffens the wrist in a way that prevents pronation, supination, flexion, and extension to any significant degree, it also made the wrists less prone to injury. But even if we don't know exactly what selection pressures led to the semilunate carpal, we still have the transitions in the fossils and the embryological support to say that it happened.
In fact, it creates a very nonsensical creature. You've got an animal that has that's supposed to be hunting with these large forelimbs that it's supposedly evolved.
This is actually a reconstruction of Archaeopteryx by Mark Turner from 2016 from Alamy. I can't find any evidence of it being used in a paper or of it being commissioned or used by a paleontologist, so using this as a consensus reconstruction is, as far as I can tell, a straw man. But let's see what the straw man is in full.
But then it's got these big feathers coming off the fingers that get in the way.
Get in the way of what? That's Archaeopteryx. Those feathers are for flying.
And when it tries to grasp something, it can't actually grasp. It has to pull its arms in and swivel the wrist sideways. It doesn't make sense at all.
As it extends the arms, the hands swivel out, allowing the fingers to flex and pull things toward the body. As the arms come in, the hands fold via abduction, pushing the item away from being held just against the chest, allowing more room for the head and neck to get at what is being clutched. This is the basic Maniraptoran prey capture arm motion, and it's very similar to modern bird wing strokes. This is how flapping evolved. Joel just keeps showing us reasons birds are dinosaurs, and then saying, nuh-uh.
So, number 2 major difference is swivel wrist.
You know, for someone trying to say that the wrist is a reason birds aren't dinosaurs, he sure showed a lot of reasons why they are.
But there's 2 more for the wings. Number 3, stabilized shoulder. All right, we've been at this a while. This is the 4th session for some of you, and
it's the first session for me.
And you might be getting a little weary, so do me a favor and just shrug it off, okay? Shrug it, and roll your shoulders back.
I can't do that. I'm not an ape.
Roll them forward. All right, very good. You guys are awesome. All right, feel a little better. Take a deep breath. All right, what you just did, all that motion in your shoulder, you can do that because the only skeletal element, the only bone attaching your arm to the rest of your body is your collarbone. It's just this little bone right here, and it can move around quite a bit.
Has Joel not heard of the scapula, the shoulder blade? What does he think that attaches to? Because it has muscular and tendon attachments to the spine.
Birds can't shrug their shoulders. Did you know that? They can't shrug their shoulders at all. Their shoulders are locked into place.
That's true.
With their rib cage and the rest of their body. They can move their neck a lot, but not their shoulders. Why is that? There's a really good reason for that. If you grew feathers on your arms and tried to fly like a bird, you would have a big problem. You'd most likely dislocate your shoulder and break your collarbone.
People don't generally manage to just break their pectoral girdles from vigorous arm motions, so I'm going to press X to doubt.
Because your shoulder is not built for flight. Flapping is a big deal to a bird. And so they need a stabilized shoulder joint that can handle all of those forces of flapping. It's a very rigorous activity. And so that's what birds have. This is a goose skeleton, and you can see this is the shoulder. The black bone is the scapula. The gray bone is the humerus, which is the first bone in the wing. And then they've got this special bone called the coracoid, which is in blue.
Is it special if basically all tetrapods, except for most but not all mammals, have it? I mean, it's got a specialized shape, but then so do most animals with most of their bones.
And that bone works with the furcula and the scapula to create a tripod-type structure, which is a really strong engineering structure. So the shoulder is kind of attached to this tripod, and so it's very stable, right? And that shoulder doesn't move. And you can see that angle. You've got that angle between the scapula and the coracoid, and That adds to that stability.
I mean, he's not wrong. I'm just wondering what he thinks makes this a problem for identifying birds as dinosaurs. If it's the wishbone, well, many dinosaurs, including Tyrannosaurus rex, had wishbones. I'm not aware of any dinosaurs that don't have a coracoid and scapula, so I am at a loss as to where he is going with this.
Dinosaurs don't have this.
Unless this is something other than a coracoid bone, they certainly do. He even highlighted it, albeit in a different color.
So this is an Allosaurus shoulder. It has a coracoid bone, but it's almost like it's just an extension of the scapula. In fact, in some cases, they're so fused it's hard to see the line between them.
But bird coracoids are also strongly fused to the scapula. The bones together form the socket the humerus goes into, and if they weren't strongly fused in birds, then the bone would just fall out of the socket.
So what would our prediction be? Our prediction would be that if these feathered maniraptors are birds, we would expect to see a reinforced shoulder joint, like what birds have.
Right, but they don't. At least not in a way that's all that much like a bird. Here's figure 1 from the paper Comments on the Morphology of Basal Paravian Shoulder Girdle, new data based on unilagid theropods and paleognathe birds. You might notice that there is actually a wide variation in Maniraptoran coracoid anatomy, with the basal most seeming much more like Allosaurus than one finds in, say, even fairly basal birds like the rhea.
Alright, so there's our goose, there's our Allosaurus. There's Cathiornis, which is an extinct bird. You can see it's got the angled scapula and coracoid bones there. And there's our Dromaeosaur, Microraptor. Same thing. It's a little bit slightly different shape, but it looks nothing like the dinosaur. It looks very avian, looks very bird-like. It's got a reinforced shoulder joint.
Okay, so if we go outside Maniraptora, we won't find this strut-like coracoid. Well, Struthiomimus seems to have had a coracoid that's strut-like if we rotate the figure to the same orientation, and it's not a Maniraptoran, which is what he thinks the word bird means. On the other hand, I'd argue that Deinonychus, from the same figure, isn't strut-like, even though it is a Maniraptoran. And of course, when we get farther from birds than even the ornithomimids, which Joel doesn't consider birds, we get to his example of basal coracoids. How about just within Coelurosauria, we can see that coracoids get more strut-like as you get closer to Maniraptora, and then within Maniraptora, they become even more like the coracoids of modern birds as you get closer to them phylogenetically. It's hard to see how this isn't evidence for evolution, rather than a problem for evolution.
Let's extend that out. You can see of the dinosaurs across the bottom, they all have those rounded coracoid bones that are just an extension of the scapula, don't have that extra stability. And across the top, you can see there's some variation, but they've all got some more of an angle and more of an elongated coracoid bone.
Too bad he's cherry-picking and avoiding intermediate coracoids. It's almost like if he didn't cherry-pick, he wouldn't have an argument.
If you look at that ostrich on the far top right, you can see that the angle's not very sharp. Why would that be?
Because ostriches don't fly, but that's another point in favor of evolution from where I'm standing.
Well, ostriches can't fly, right? So they don't need as much of that stability, so it has a broader angle. And so we see that in some of these extinct animals too, like Caudipteryx. The angle's not quite as strong. It was most likely flightless.
Yes, but the coracoid is also shorter, and also animals like Caudipteryx are missing other features of modern birds, such as the extensive bone fusion, keel, inverted hallux, etc. This argument for Caudipteryx not being transitional because of the angle between the longest axis of the scapula and that of the coracoid only works if you take that one feature in isolation. If you even look at the rest of the shoulder girdle, it doesn't really work. And if you look at the rest of the animal, it becomes obvious that this is an argument that cannot be used in good faith.
But it still doesn't look like a dinosaur shoulder.
In what way? Look, here's a bird shoulder from a modern bird. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is the way that the coracoid fuses into the sternum. This is how all modern birds are, and yet another skeletal characteristic that could be fairly used to define crowned birds. Look at these non-avian Maniraptoran shoulder girdles. None of them do this. The scapula and sternum sure connect, but they aren't fused like in the birds. If we want to isolate just coracoid angle, sure, we can do that, and of course, the more bird-like the animal, the more bird-like the shape of the coracoid will be. But to say that these non-avian maniraptors have shoulders that are more like a bird's than those of more basal dinosaurs like Allosaurus is just wildly incorrect. It's hard to even comprehend the level of either not checking or outright dishonesty it takes to make this claim. Yes, the scapula and the sternum interface, but not nearly as completely or with the flange shape interface seen in birds. I don't see how you come to this conclusion honestly, unless you're just very motivated in your reasoning.
And it's really cool, the muscle system that birds have around their shoulder joint. They've got a really elaborate pulley system in their shoulder.
Which virtually no Maniraptorans have, except those actually in aves. Even most aviolans don't have a pulley system like modern birds.
So they have a muscle that attaches to the sternum, and it loops up through something called the triosteal canal and attaches to the humerus and helps raise the wing. It's a pulley system. So how did a dinosaur shoulder with a usual deltoid muscle that just helped raise the arm loop through a canal to create a completely different muscle structure? It even reversed the direction that it was pulling.
That's a great question if the answer is, how did some birds evolve this structure? But there are a few things to address first. The big one is that Joel is just making up a cartilaginous Chelon microraptor that he has no evidence for. Something to note is that fundamentally, the supracoracoideus is the same muscle as the deltoid. It has just shifted to be attached down at the sternum rather than simply terminating at the anterior margin of the coracoid and the anteroventral margin of the scapula. So where does this idea of Microraptor having a supracoracoideus elevator come from? Well, it's Joel's Posts and Answers research blog. He simply decided that since Maniraptor is a bird by his fiat, that it must have the features of a bird, and now he's using the features of a bird that he made up based on thinking it is a bird to now argue that it is a bird. You might notice that that's just blatant question begging. Further, a group of animals you may have heard of are the enantiornithines. The name means opposite bird, and what's opposite about them, you might ask? Well, it's exactly this. They don't have supracoracoideus elevators, rather that muscle is an abductor. So if not having supracoracoideus-based elevation of the wing is a problem for science, it's just as much a problem for Joel, given that according to him it's a characteristic of birds, but most fossil Maniraptoran groups lack it. As far as how the supracoracoideus itself specifically evolved, it's not very well documented from what I can tell. That being said, as an embryo grows, it can shift muscle attachments, and since there's a continuous extent of bone from the coracoid down to the end of the sternum, all that really needs to happen is for the deltoid to keep progressing its attachment point further down. As this happens, the coracoid tuber can help it be stabilized, hence why it's so prominent in modern birds. But further, the source he relies on in his paper, one I've already referenced, that is, Comments on the Morphology of Basal Paravian Shoulder Girdle, new data based on unilagid theropods and paleognathed birds, concludes that the muscle in question was not a wing elevator, but rather a protector, as I stated earlier. That is, it swung the wing forward, not up. But hey, it used the magic word supracoracoideus a whole lot, so I guess that means Microraptor had a wing that elevated the way modern bird wings do, except no, that directly contradicts his source. And of course, that paper actually finds support, not problems, for the identity of birds as dinosaurs. I know that was all very technical, but to dumb it down, he's making up anatomy in Microraptor for which we have no evidence, and it's at least the second time he's done so. Further, his own source does not actually support his contention.
So, Microraptor, if you look at that, the latest research indicates that Microraptor and these other feathered Maniraptorans had a similar pulley structure.
Similar, yes. The same as on birds? No.
So their shoulder was very much bird.
You know, except when it wasn't, which is rather what you'd expect if birds are dinosaurs, that you would find animals with bird-like traits that aren't quite what we find on modern birds. And lo and behold, Joel has helped us confirm that that is indeed what we do find.
So, our third major difference is that stabilized shoulder.
And he still hasn't shown how, even if what he said about any of them were 100% true, that would be a problem for identifying birds as dinosaurs.
All right, one more wing difference, and that is the shoulder joint. Okay?
I feel like that's what we were just going over, but okay, I'm going to need a stiff drink after this. I should prep a very stiff, very dry martini. Maybe it can be a bit dirty in honor of the dirty tactics of creationists.
All right, make like you're going to do a chicken dance. All right, and then raise your shoulders. Okay, raise your arms up, get your elbows up, see how high you can go.
I'm a bee. I can't even get my arm that high. Stupid ape supremacist.
All right, so you can get up there a little ways. If you straighten your arms out, interestingly, you can raise your arms up higher, right? So that's what a bird needs, right? They need a wide range of motion in their arm, right? In their wing. And so that's what we see in birds. This is a kind of a cross-section through a bird, a European starling. And you can see the coracoid and the furcula bone, those two white bones. And then you can see the blue part, which is the range of motion of the humerus, okay?
Okay, but I also noticed that starling has a very prominent deltoid pectoral crest, like is characteristic of dinosaurs. I wonder if we'll ever hear about that.
And then there's that red with the little arrow. It's called a glenoid, a lateral-facing glenoid. And so that's just the fancy word for the socket that shoulder attaches into, right?
That's true.
And it needs that range of motion. So that glenoid, that socket that is in the shoulder, it's located high on the body, and it's angled sideways so that they have a wide range of motion. Well, let's look at a dinosaur shoulder. This is our Allosaurus. You think it could flap?
No, I don't think it could flap, but no one is suggesting that Allosaurus is a bird. Like, the argument is apparently that birds can't be dinosaurs unless all dinosaurs are birds. But that doesn't make any sense. Birds are a subset of dinosaurs. Like, think about this argument applied to bats. Bats, like birds, have to be able to flap, and so need to be able to raise their arms past their spines. Now, basically, no mammals, even apes, can do this apart from bats. Bats also have laterally facing glenoids. And other mammals do not. I mean, have you ever seen a moose or a tiger or a pangolin flap its arms like a bat? No, you have not. So, do we draw the conclusion that bats are not mammals? No, we don't, because nothing about glenoid facing is part of the definition of mammal. Is this even evidence against bats being mammals? No, it's not. But this just comes back to what we've been going on about the whole time. He never bothered to tell us what a dinosaur is in the first place, so of course, he can't actually make arguments that birds aren't dinosaurs. Instead, all he can do is show reasons why birds may be unique among dinosaurs. But that's it. Being unique among a group doesn't negate your membership in that group. And Chylosaurs are unique among dinosaurs for their acetabula that close as they grow up, and for their heavy armor and spikes. That doesn't make them not dinosaurs, even though I can point to things about them that no other dinosaur has. Similarly, primates are unique among mammals for their entirely enclosed forward-facing orbits. Does this make primates not mammals? No, of course not. But if I wanted to say that snakes are not mammals, how would I do it? Well, I wouldn't point out unique features of snakes, like their elongated body and only one functional lung, or their weirdly flexible jaw joints, or their lack of eyelids. All of those are things that could keep snakes as mammals, just very strange ones. Instead, I would point out things like that they don't give milk. I point out what they lack, and that what they lack are the very traits that make mammals mammals. Snakes lack a dental squamosal jaw joint, they lack hair, they lack mammary glands, they lack a division between the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae, etc. That's why they're not mammals. It's what they lack, not what they have. So what do dinosaurs characteristically have that birds don't? Well, basically nothing. Despite Fiducia's attempt to say that lacking a supraacetabular crest means that bird acetabula are no longer perforate, I don't even know how to parse that one as making sense.
No, definitely not. Not only does it have a much smaller arm, forelimb, but it's angled down, it's located lower on the body. So
since birds evolved from dinosaurs, we should expect to see dinosaurs that lack avian features. We do. I wouldn't exactly call that a slam dunk for avian evolution among dinosaurs, since if birds aren't dinosaurs, we should still also see dinosaurs that lack particularly avian features. But it's certainly not a problem.
how about some of these feathered manoraptors? What do they look like? Well, here's Microraptor.
Yes, no one is surprised that a derived Paravian dinosaur had at least some flight capability, and could flap its arms. But was that true of more distant relations like oviraptors? No, it wasn't. And again, just moving the word bird to become identical to Manoraptoran doesn't negate the fact that as you go farther and farther from crowned birds, among the Manoraptorans, the less lateral the glenoid is. And Joel can't say that's just because they're flightless birds, because flightless birds typically retain the lateral facing of the glenoid, as you can see in this picture of a kakapo with its wings well past its spine, or this flightless cormorant in a similar position of the wings. Even ostriches retain the ability to lift their wings well past the spine, as they do so during courtship displays. Do you think that Joel will show the contrary examples among Manoraptors? Or do you think he'll just cherry-pick the ones that are far closer to birds than, say, Oviraptorosaurs, and never mention that not all Manoraptors have laterally oriented glenoids, therefore ruining this argument? Let me know in the comments.
Shoulder is located high on the body. You can see the coracoid and the sternum there.
And I noticed that in Microraptor, the interface between the coracoid and the sternum has both bones being convex, unlike in crown birds, where the interface is convex for the coracoid, but concave on the sternum. Why is there such a weaker connection in Microraptor? That's not how it is in any avians. It's almost like Microraptor is transitional.
And the glenoid is pointing out. It's got that wide range of motion. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to see even on the side view.
No, it's not, because the main motion in flapping is more or less linear when viewed laterally. When viewed perpendicular to the lateral view facing either the back or the front of the animal, the motion describes a wide arc. Joel must be about as good at understanding 3 dimensions as the average flat earther.
You can see the Allosaurus there. All it can do, its arm is just pointed down and to the rear of the animal. Just got a little range of motion there, not a lot. But
it's not a bird, and so we shouldn't expect it to have a bird-like range of motion. And since facing of the glenoid has never been a diagnostic criterion for dinosaurs, this whole thing is rather pointless.
The Microraptor and the starling have a broad range of motion for their wing, right? And you need that to be able to fly.
Hence why we shouldn't be surprised that dinosaurs that couldn't fly, including within Maniraptora, didn't have this feature.
And that's consistent across these feathered Maniraptors.
And of course, yeah, he just cherry-picked an example from Maniraptora and ignored the counterexamples. You know, ignoring relevant evidence is a hallmark of pseudoscience.
So, there's our first 4. Feathers, swivel wrist, stabilized shoulder, and that specialized shoulder joint.
And even if he were right about all of them, which he wasn't, none of them are reasons that birds aren't dinosaurs. They're all just features that make birds unique among dinosaurs.
So we took these, and we said, okay, let's analyze these across 157 different species of non-avian dinosaurs. Okay.
I'm curious to know where his results were published, because it's definitely not in his paper that is the basis for this whole talk.
And then the first row there is birds. So blue is all bird characteristics, green is all dinosaur characteristics.
So when he said we, he meant Turner et al. Way to take credit for the works of others, Joel. Also, notice how there are actually 4 taxa up there that mix what he calls dinosaur traits with bird traits, that being Oviraptorosaurs, Scansorgopterigidae, which Joel has spelled incorrectly, Coelurosauria as a whole, which is weird since all the other taxa are groups of Coelurosaurs, and also Therizinosaurs. Even his own data analysis, which we already know to be biased since he can't tell the difference between a uniquely bird trait and the lack of a defining dinosaur trait, shows transitional forms. Absolutely stunning.
And you can see there's a pattern there, right? These are different family groupings.
I can see a pattern. Maniraptorans farther from birds such as Therizinosaurs are more dinosaur-like according to Joel. Oviraptorosaurs, which are closer to birds, are more bird-like, but still what Joel considers dinosaur-like to some degree. And then finally, the ones closest to birds, the Dromaeosaurs and Troodontids, are basically birds according to Joel. This is exactly the pattern of evolution, and Joel is just showing it on screen.
And now you might be looking at some of these, and you might see that the Dromaeosaurs and the Troodontids and the Oviraptors, some of them are kind of big.
No, that's not what I noticed. I noticed that Joel's own charts show the pattern expected by evolution, after you filter it through his absolutely insane version of how taxonomy works.
Bad Rexy. Get back. Move back. All right, stay still. Right there. Okay.
That's a suspiciously good T-Rex model. I can't seem to find it available for purchase. I'm legitimately impressed. And given that Joel is at least a minimally proficient Blender user according to his paper, it's possible he made this. If so, I must commend him. That's an excellent and quite accurate T-Rex. Although at some point the position of the hands were a little suspicious. I suppose that makes sense though, since as we saw with the Velociraptor skeleton he showed us in the first part of this, he doesn't mind dislocating bones if it suits him.
He's a big guy, Tyrannosaurus Rex. 43 feet long, very large, one of the largest predators to ever walk the earth, right?
Yep, although the length varied.
Allosaurus, also pretty big.
Okay, well, every nice thing I said about that Tyrannosaurus is not true for this Allosaurus. That looks like it came straight out of an AI image generator, especially with the weird peg-like teeth, the wrong number of fingers, everything about the arms being long and out of proportion, the weird shrink wrapping of the face, the iguana spines that just kind of melt into the neck, the weird tumors or whatever on the torso. This is disgusting.
32 feet long. So sometimes we think that dinosaurs are big and birds are small, right? You got a blue jay or a raven. That's a big chicken.
Is this just a long-winded way to say that some dinosaurs are small and some birds are big? Because, I mean, that's true, but why spend so much time on it?
Some chickens actually get that big.
Okay.
Ever been chased by a goose? That's not much fun.
Get on with it.
Ostrich, heaviest bird alive, 9 feet tall. It's a really big bird. This is a marabou stork. They're really impressive when they fly. We have a couple of these at the Ark Encounter Zoo. You should check them out. 8.5-foot wingspan. Not the biggest flying bird, though.
Okay, I'm cutting until he makes a point.
But you can't use size, as you can see, to tell the difference between birds and dinosaurs. We have to use other criteria.
I cut a bunch, and yeah, that was his whole point. Also, he used reconstructions of Sinosauropteryx, Microraptor, and Jianhuanlong that are misleading to the point of being outright lies.
Because there's big dinosaurs and small dinosaurs. There's big birds and there's smaller birds. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, what about some of the bigger dromaeosaurs, and some of the bigger oviraptorosaurs, like these guys?
No, I'm not wondering what about those guys. I'm wondering when Joel is actually going to give us a way to tell if birds are dinosaurs or not, rather than a way to tell if a dinosaur is a bird or not. Because he claims to want to do the former, yet all he's done is the latter.
Well, we're going to talk about them in a little bit.
Oh good, he's foreshadowing my future suffering.
All right, so now we're going to move on to the last 3 criteria.
He might be moving on, but I'm not, at least not this week. I feel like this is as good a stopping point as any, and if I finish the rest of this video, this one will become so big I'll never get it done. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bentovind, Thurevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Elron Teller, Ian Chen, Calvin Brostig von Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, Edwin M., North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.